Good afternoon. My name is Steve Sempier. I'm with Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium. We appreciate everyone in the room who is willing to take time out today to come join us. I know there's a lot of different meetings, concurrent meetings happening this afternoon. And thank you to everybody who's dialing into. We'll have about an hour, hour and a half presentation followed by some questions and answer period. But again, we want to thank you all for taking some time to join us today. As we share oil spill science as it applies to management, this presentation will be presented actually by 5 of us. We make up an oil spill science outreach team that's part of Sea Grant. There's somebody from Texas Sea Grant, Louisiana Sea Grant, Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant, and Florida Sea Grant as part of the team. So we definitely want to recognize and thank the Gulf of Mexico Alliance for providing this space for us to meet today and serving as host for our meeting. And specifically Laura Bowie, who's Executive Director for the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. What we're going to be talking about today definitely relates to the GOMA, the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, and can be applied more broadly as well. But what I wanted to point out here is this is the organizational chart in Action Plan 3. And the bottom right here, you can see the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. This is administered by the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, and there's a 20-member independent research board that makes funding decisions on behalf of GoMRI, as well as some policy decisions as well. So there's obviously a direct linkage between GOMA, the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, and GoMRI. GoMRI is a $500 million 10-year investment with the goal to improve society's ability to understand, respond to, and mitigate the effects of petroleum pollution and related stressors. GoMRI focuses on 5 different focus areas. One is how oil and dispersants move around. How do they break down? How do they impact the environment? And then from the technology perspective, how do we advance technology to understand those questions I just posed? And then finally, how do oil spills impact people? GoMRI has made quite a bit of investment already. Over $350 million have already been allocated through GoMRI, which started in 2010. Funding recipients are all over the country, 42 different states, more than 270 different academic institutions, 17 other countries outside the United States are all part of the GoMRI enterprise. And when you look at it from the perspective of the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, or Gulf of Mexico, which many of you are in, 71% of the funding is spent here in the Gulf of Mexico, with 26% in other states and 3% internationally. But that's just part of the picture. That's the funding side. What I wanted to share too was the output side, the production. You can see that as of last week, these numbers keep growing almost on a daily basis, but 729 peer-reviewed publications have been released, more than 2,800 scientific presentations and posters, and more than 3,000 people have been supported by GoMRI, whether they're scientists, postdocs, graduate students, outreach professionals, and others. I just wanted to share this slide to show you some of the intersections between the Gulf of Mexico Alliance priorities and GoMRI investments. If you look in bold, those are the 6 priority issue teams for GOMA. And Larissa, actually, at the end, will talk a little more about how there's some intersections with data and monitoring and education and engagement. But the other 4 pits, you can see we did a search of GoMRI projects, some keyword searches, and you can see the word resilience is in 18 different GoMRI projects. The word habitat's in 30 different GoMRI-supported projects, and that doesn't count projects that might have just said oyster reefs or mangroves or seagrasses. So there's actually more than that intersect, again, with the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. So where does Sea Grant fit in this context? So GoMRI is funding quite a bit of research, and Sea Grant is a university-based program. We do fund research as well, but we also have an extension and education component as well. And we're a non-advocacy organization, and we live in the communities that we serve. And so, as I mentioned, we have a team supported through GoMRI that translates oil spill science and shares that, and that's what you're going to be hearing some today. So why specifically are we here? We're focused today on science to application. So science for use in management, for use in other types of decision-making, response to emergencies, that's obviously a key component, and then also response to misinterpretation. There's many times that people who we work with on a daily basis might read a recent newspaper article that translated a peer-reviewed publication, and they have questions. Was it translated the right way? Am I reading this correctly? And so part of our job is to help with that translation by building that trust with the people we work with. And so we do that as well. This is how we're going to make the linkages today. As I mentioned, the Gulf of Mexico Alliance has Action Plan 3. There's 6 priority issue teams within that action plan and several actions. And what we've done is identified 8 questions that directly link to the actions that are outlined in the Gulf of Mexico Alliance Action Plan 3. Now, those of you who pre-registered already have seen those questions, and those questions definitely link to GOMA, but even if you're not part of GOMA, which many of the people on the phone are not necessarily related to GOMA, these questions are applicable for you too. But again, we're trying to draw those connections to GOMA throughout the presentation today. The science we're going to be sharing is peer-reviewed, which means it's been vetted through the science community, and/or it's also been included in agency reports. Federal, state agencies have their peer review processes before it gets publicly released too. We're also not just drawing GoMRI science. Our job is to translate and synthesize oil spill science across the vast array of funding entities. So we include, you'll see today some data from PDART, which was just released in February, from other agencies, many different scientific journals. So again, we're trying to answer the 8 questions today. In those 8 questions, we could spend a day, 2 days, a week, maybe even a month doing seminars just on each individual question. So today is a little bit of a tease where we're just going to do a thumbnail sketch answers to those questions, and but we can definitely go more in depth as we move along. Here are some questions to think about as we go about our presentation today. One is, we'd like you to think about this as we answer the questions. How could the science that we present today be incorporated into GOMA Action Plan 3? Those of you in the room, many of you are going to be spending the next 3 or 4 days building out your Action Plan 3. Are there some elements that we're going to talk about today that can be incorporated into that? And if so, we'd be happy to be part of that conversation. Also, outside of GOMA, how can or will this work apply to you, your day-to-day work? How can this information help you? This feedback will help us as we continue to refine our process of sharing information with you. And finally, what are other oil spill-related questions or information needs? We have several questions we'd like to ask you, as I mentioned, but we also want to hear back from you. So at the end of these presentations, we're going to have a question and answer period. So please think of what your questions may be. We'll definitely spend as much time as we need to answering those questions. That will also feed into our other outreach publications. You see out by the door here, there's a number of publications. I saw some of you pick those up. Those of you on the phone can access those online as well. We'll also be doing a number of seminars. I think this is about our 13th seminar, but we'll have at least another 12, 13 or more seminars in front of us over the next 3 years, as well as other products like videos and other things we'll be using. So your questions will help feed that process. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to transition into those questions. You can see up here we have a question and then, again, a link to a GOMA action that's in Action Plan 3. And so we're going to start with Monica Wilson. She's a Florida Sea Grant. She's a physical oceanographer by training, and she will take over from here.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. Okay. So as Steve said, the question that I'm hoping to answer is what habitats were impacted and how? And so just a quick background, these are the habitats I'll be slightly, very, touching a bit. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I will be sharing some science about some of the oil spill and the impacts that it had on these different habitats. So just as a background, the oil spill impacted about approximately 1,300 miles of shoreline. And as you can see, this figure shows you what coastlines were oiled and how much was oiled. So the colors indicate the amount of oiling that these shorelines saw. So blue indicates no oil was observed in these locations, and red being heavy oils, these locations were heavily oiled. And just to split that up by state, this is just a pie chart that shows the percentage of what states got oiled more than others. And as you can see, Louisiana, approximately 64% of that oil came to the Louisiana, impacting around approximately 847 miles of the Louisiana coastline. And the other states are also there. I won't go into too much detail. So now we're going to go ahead and split it up by coastal habitat. So out of the 1,300 miles of shoreline that were oiled, 52% of that was wetlands. And most of those wetlands, as you can see here circled in the map, was here in Louisiana. And you can see again that there's a lot of red in that area where it's circled, meaning that these wetlands were heavily oiled. So, and as most of you, I'm sure, are aware, that the coast of Louisiana has experienced rapid land loss. In this picture is a map that indicates land loss from the 1900s and predicted land loss up to the 2050. So some estimate that this area of Louisiana is losing about a football field of wetlands almost every 45 minutes. And if you compare that to the map that's inserted up there, you can see that, again, this same area was heavily impacted by oil. So here's some photos of Barretera Bay, Louisiana. On the left is the marsh that has been unoiled, and on the right is the marsh that has been oiled. And you can distinctly see the differences. On the left, we have a nice even marsh edge, which indicates even erosion. And on the right, we can see that there's embayments and impacts from the oil. And you can see that the erosion is not even anymore. And you can see the impacts that the oil has had. And so scientists are studying how the oiling can impact these marshes. And so they know that marshes when moderately oiled marshes can recover fairly quickly. However, if they are heavily oiled, it can go ahead and smother the roots. And the roots are basically the structural integrity of these marshes. And so if the roots get oiled and the marsh loses its structural integrity and it can no longer hold sediment, and then we get these faster rates of erosion, and the marsh begins to collapse and erode away faster. Another study, scientists actually were using satellite imagery along with these variables that they called canopy chlorophyll content and above green biomass. And these apparently are variables that can actually are closely related to the productivity and the vegetation health of these marshes. So on the left, there's two pictures on the left. I don't know if you can see in the light, but there's red markings. And the red markings indicate the amount of decrease from 2009 to 2010. And the pie chart, the bar graph in the middle, also indicates the decrease from 2009 and 2010 in both of these variables. And if you can see, the black bar graph is 2010, and it's the larger the bar graph, the more decrease there was in land loss. So we can see the significant difference. And these scientists found that June of 2010 was the worst month in terms of salt marsh health across Louisiana. So just as a quick reference, so NOAA puts out these oil spill responses and spills in marshes, and they have these resources that are available to those, and it gives you advice on response and cleanup techniques for each individual habitat, but it also lets you know about the disadvantages and advantages of each one and how to basically look and see if the response will outweigh the good or the bad, and how to make those decisions in the future when something like this will happen. So now we're going to go ahead and move over to beaches. So out of 1,300 miles of shoreline that was oiled, approximately 46% of that was beaches, mostly seen, of course, in this circled area in Alabama and Mississippi beaches were heavily oiled. So how does this oil wash up on the beaches? So during an oil spill, the oil, obviously the water transports it to and from the shore, and as water levels increase and decrease, the oil gets deposited on the shoreline. Some of this oil can also mix with sediments and actually sink. And if you sink and possibly create these tar mats that then eventually, again, get buried by sand and when water washes in and out with the tide. And then when possibly another storm event comes and waves and wind energy increase, these tar mats and the water sloshing back and forth, the tar mats get broken up and cause these tar balls, which you see here were also known as surface residual balls, which will eventually wash ashore as the waters move back and forth. So scientists were interested to see how a big storm could break up these surface residual balls. And so they found out in the field that tar balls would wash up during the relaxation phases of storm. So the storm would blow in, cause a lot of wave energy, a lot of wind energy, and once the storm went away, they'd go out to the beach, and all of a sudden more tar balls would show up on the beach. And so the scientists were curious to see how this was happening. So they actually went in the lab and used a wave tank, which you see over here, and made artificial tar balls. And they made them different sizes, 10 centimeters, 5 centimeters, less than 1 centimeter, and they would simulate wave energy through this tank. And they noticed that at 10 centimeters, these balls were actually buried. The artificial tar balls that were 5 centimeters were mobile in the surf, and then the ones that were less than 1 centimeter were really hard to recover. So that was great information for these scientists. So once they found that out, they took it to and used this ocean model here. And so on the left, this whole column right here is just small waves, and on the right, it's large waves. Each row indicates a different size of surface residual ball. The colors over here indicate blue, there's immobile, they're not moving, and the hotter, the warmer colors up to pink mean more mobile. So what you can see here is that with small waves, there isn't a lot of motion going on. You get a little bit of keels and things here, but not too many. Well, when they go ahead and simulate large waves, at the sediment size, you see all this pink. So you can see that it takes the larger waves to move these surface residual balls around. And even surface residual balls that were 10 centimeters, again, there's not a lot of movement, there's some, but it's not in the pink area, which corresponds with their lab results that show the 10 centimeter balls were getting buried and not moving much. So again, so how is this helpful? Well, the findings that the scientists are showing in these models can basically help and maybe help scientists go out in the field and collect and possibly have an indication of where these balls might be actually surfacing and can collect and, again, do analysis on there. But as far as beach response and cleanup techniques, NOAA also has these job aids that, again, will help kind of not tell you how to clean up, but basically help you get ideas of how to clean up, what responses might work in different situations, and what not to do in particular situations. So resources are available to help with that. So moving on to mangroves. So we all know mangroves are important for maintaining shoreline protection and stabilization. They are essential feeding and nursery habitat for juvenile fish, and they also, the roots and their integrity also help provide excellent habitat for small organisms. And so mangrove forests, we also know, can be limited by water mixing by waves, currents, and tidal effects, and are likely more severely affected by oil spill. So effects of the oil would depend on oil type, the elapsed time between a spill and its stranding, the wave and water currents, and also tidal stage. So if there is not a whole lot of water movement going on in this particular mangrove forest, then obviously oil will probably be more stagnant there, impacting the mangroves a little bit more. They have shown that the impacts of oil are mortality amongst the propagules, the seedlings, and the juvenile trees, and this reason just being because they're right there at the surface, and that's where the oil is, so that can impact them a whole lot. But they also have shown that the oil can cause a weakened state of these trees, and then it can affect these species. Obviously, if the trees weaken, trees can die off. There's not so much habitat for these animals to live on anymore. And then also, anything a few years after the spill, the persistence of toxic compounds in the water could have a long-term impact on these mangroves as well. So a few studies that happened back in 1997, Professor Proffitt looked at impacts of epibiota, epibiota is just the plants and the organisms that live on these mangroves. And so what he noticed is that after a spill, a lot of these animals were either smothered or impacted by the toxicity of the oil. And then on the long-term basis, what he found was, again, the structure of the trees was being impacted by the oil, and so these epibiota did not have somewhere to hang on to or to live by, and so that's how they were being impacted on a long-term basis. In a more recent study, Hansel looked at the impact of oil on the water transport through the roots of these mangroves. So they split up these mangroves on these pictures that you see here. They put roots in different solutions of seawater plus oil plus dispersant. And what they found was any time that there was oil dispersant in the water, although water was still going through the roots, it wasn't at a rate as where it was just when it was the roots were in normal seawater. And if you look at this picture, just to make a comparison, so this root was in seawater plus oil, and you can see that it's really dry. So they noticed that this is the top part of the root. So they know that water is not going there because it's really dry, so the water transport is very limited. In this next picture, this is seawater plus oil plus dispersant. It's not as dry as the one with oil, so they knew that water was actually vertically being transported through the root. However, if you look at the layers between the root system are starting to peel back. So, and that's the one with dispersant. So they realized that it was impacting, again, the structural integrity of the tree, because although these dispersants were allowing water to actually transport through the root, it was still impacting the tree, just because of the chemicals that are found in it. So we're going to do, yes, we are. Again, another resource, mangrove response and cleanup techniques. And so mangroves are a lot more difficult to protect. I mean, it's hard to get people in there. They're very, they're hard to access, and you know, it's obviously you're not going to get large pieces of equipment in there to clean these up. So some response techniques that they recommend are mechanical containment with booms and skimmers, and they recommend dispersant and in situ burning offshore to try to minimize the impacts of the oil, not in the forest. One thing that they do not recommend highly, is cutting back trees or burning the trees, because obviously mangroves are take long to come to a mature stage. So if you did that, it would recovery time would be much longer. So, but there's a resource there if you need some more information about cleanup techniques and response techniques for mangroves. So now I'm going to talk about coral impacts. So the Gulf of Mexico has a few corals, and the ones I'm going to be talking about are these Mesophotic reefs, which Mesophotic are just coral communities that are found at water depths where light penetration is low. And then we'll speak a little bit about the deep sea corals as well. So scientists have been studying these Mesophotic corals for oil spill impact, and in 2011 they used an ROV to go and take these pictures and conduct transects and mark corals with reflective tape, photograph them, and then they returned back in 2014 to take photos again. So they do the comparison, and I mean, I don't have to tell you that you can obviously see the differences between these corals. So they found clear evidence of injury from these corals on the Mesophotic reef that were situated below the surface of the oil slick during deepwater horizon. There was a significant decline in their conditions near sites nearest to the wellhead. Decline conditions were severe. Anywhere from more than like 50% of the colonies were injured in 2011. And obviously these corals are in an area that are not necessarily easily accessible by humans. So restoration and things like that are a little bit are not feasible. And so these corals have been around for a while. For them to recover is probably less than likely. And then just on deep sea corals, so the scientists went and looked at Gorgonian corals in the deep sea. And this is just pictures of the same coral progression pictures. In 2010, they could see that corals were covered in this brown flocculent material, and when they fingerprinted that material, they found deepwater horizon oil in that material. And as the time went by, they could see that the coral tissue was starting to come off. In 2011, they noticed that hydroids colonized these corals, and hydroids are these little tiny jellyfish that will attach to corals, and that's basically a form of deterioration. So scientists know that that's another way to see that the corals are deteriorating when they see these hydroids attaching to the corals. And as you can see, as the time frame goes on, you can see the coral branching and the death of these corals. Again, deep sea corals, not easily accessible to humans. These corals have been around for hundreds, thousands of years, so chance of recovery or quick recovery is probably not feasible again. Again, there's another resource for the corals response and restoration techniques. One of the main things is limit physical contact, which in the deep sea corals, that's probably not going to happen. But the goal is to minimize damage by the spill, and all response options should be evaluated to determine whether the ultimate benefit from the response would actually outweigh the cost or impact of your action. That is the most important thing. They have some advice on restoration, saying reef crust should be stabilized. Coral transplanting, if that's available, that's a good idea. And then natural recovery is always another option. And just a quick, why is this important? So there are task forces, management plans that exist to protect these habitats from events such as deepwater horizon. So it is important to keep these results in mind, and others, if you have any other questions, when reviewing or updating these plans, as well as knowing where to find the latest data, such as a place such as GridC has all the data that GoMRI has. All the data that's come from GoMRI is on this data site, which we'll talk about a little bit more later in the presentation. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to my Louisiana Sea Grant, Emily Mong-Douglas.
Thanks. Well, before I get into the topic of the relationship between human health and the spill, I'd like for us to take a step back and think about some of the factors involved in the spill itself. So as we all know, there are 172 million gallons of oil released into the Gulf of Mexico, and 1.84 million gallons of chemical dispersants were applied to help mitigate the impacts from oiling of the shoreline and of our fish and animals, and also to help enhance the natural breakdown of the oil by microbes in the water. An unintended consequence of this use of dispersants, however, is that this actually increased the availability of oil-based compounds in the water. And when I'm referring to oil-based compounds during this presentation, I'm really talking about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. So PAHs, oil spills are not the only source of PAHs. They're found in everyday things like coal and tar and asphalt. And does anyone in here like barbecue? Barbecue, right? Yeah, okay, so that's also another source of PAHs. But the reason why they're a cause for concern during an oil spill is because some, though not all of them, are considered to be carcinogenic. So with that said, you might be wondering, well, what are the levels of those compounds in our coastal waters? Scientists went out in the Gulf of Mexico beginning in May of 2010, and they took water samples from 4 locations along the Gulf, you can see here on this map, and they sampled all the way through the summer of the following year. And what they found is that while, yes, the levels of these compounds did increase significantly fairly soon after the spill, by March of 2011, all of those sites were back at pre-oiling concentrations. However, they did note that at one location, those levels of PAHs did rise again, and they attributed this to a large storm event and some near-shore cleanup activities that were intense during that period. So it's just a good reminder to take into account both large and small-scale factors when considering this kind of data, because it can be complicated. So with that said, you might be next considering, well, okay, we know approximately what the concentrations are along the coastline. What about how those levels might impact human health? So the EPA set out a series of benchmarks, or you could think of them kind of like thresholds, for a few individual PAHs. They don't have them available for all of them. PAHs, remember, are not just one compound, but they're a whole suite of compounds. And so these are the benchmarks or the thresholds for what's safe for a child to go swimming in the water, as set by the EPA. So you can see that the lowest among those is naphthalene to your far left. And if you want to line, that's for that single compound. And if you want to line that up with the data from that study that I just mentioned to you, that study didn't just look at one compound, it looked at 33 PAHs. And they found that the sum total of those PAHs, this gray bar here on the far right, is actually 10 times lower than the lowest threshold set by the EPA for that single compound, naphthalene. So there's a fairly good margin of safety in terms of human health, but again, you know, it's something that maybe points to continual monitoring is needed. And in terms of dispersants, what about dispersants along our coastal waters? So scientists in the community of Orange Beach, Alabama teamed up together, and these GoMRI scientists sampled along these locations of Alabama, and they tested for the chemicals that are found in Corexit. And I'd like to make the distinction that Corexit is not just one compound, it's a product, so it's several compounds working together. So they tested for these chemicals in their coastal waters, and they did find the presence of those chemicals. However, they noticed that there was a cyclical pattern, that the levels ebbed and flowed with large precipitation events, which led the researchers to realize that these chemicals aren't really from Corexit. They're more likely from things like wastewater treatment plant runoff, outfall, and stormwater runoff. So if you're wondering, well, how did these chemicals get in our wastewater treatment system? they can actually be found in many common products like our laundry detergents and resins. So again, another example of needing to take many things into consideration when thinking about this kind of data set. So that doesn't really help us get at our question of what impacts this might have on human health and what those levels are. We can kind of go a little bit roundabout to answer that. So after the spill, scientists went out on research vessels and sampled all along the wellhead, which the wellhead is that little dot right there, that triangle, yellow in the middle. And all of these dots around it with numbers are sampling locations. So scientists went out and they took water samples and they took them back to the lab and did chemical analysis to look for DOS. And you can kind of think of DOS as like the active ingredient in Corexit. So they analyzed the samples for DOS, and they found that excluding the area that was immediately surrounding the wellhead, the highest concentration of DOS was 1 part per million, and that's 100 times lower than the level found by the EPA and FDA in a study to cause injury to the human liver. So again, there's a relatively large margin of safety there, but of course, more research is always needing to be done. So I think given the nature of this audience, you all are probably really familiar with the fact that our seafood is safe to eat. It's very well tested. There's a collaboration between federal and state agencies to test the heck out of 22,000 samples of finfish and shellfish, and they looked at levels of PAHs and DOS, that active ingredient in Corexit that we were talking about, and they found out that not one of those samples came out above that level of concern as set by the FDA. But if you're interested in a little bit more resolution about the data, so that level of concern as set by the FDA is in that orange rectangle here on your left, and you can see that these levels are pretty big numbers, right? These are the levels on the far right. These are the levels that were actually found in the seafood after the fisheries were reopened. So if you compare the numbers that were in the seafood on the right with the numbers from the FDA, you can see that they're, in many cases, thousands and thousands and thousands of times lower than what the FDA says, hey, if you hit this limit, it's too high. So the seafood is definitely safe to eat. And if we are curious, well, what about over time? Did the levels of PAHs increase after Deepwater Horizon to before? They did chemical analysis of that as well, and that's what's in that left-hand column. That's before Deepwater Horizon. And then the right-hand column, again, is after. You can see that there were slight decreases. So just something interesting to think about. So with all that, the human health work, obviously a lot more needs to continue to be done in that area, but you have a little idea of some of the stuff that's out there. What about aquatic life? What are the impacts there to some of those potential stressors from the oil spill? We start out with dispersants. So the U.S. EPA did testing with their 2 model organisms, the mysid shrimp and the inland silverside, during the spill, and they found that fairly high levels were needed of Corexit to elicit 50% mortality in their study populations, and so that labels Corexit by EPA standards as slightly toxic to practically non-toxic. And in terms of blue crabs and oysters, 2 groups that I thought this audience might be interested in, again, fairly high levels, actually really high levels of Corexit were needed to cause mortality in either one of those groups. So that's just dispersant by itself. But what about PAHs? This is maybe a slightly more likely scenario out in the environment, animals encountering PAHs. So if we take aquatic invertebrates as an example, they have stereotypically poorly developed detoxification mechanisms in their bodies, and this can cause bioaccumulation in some species. And this is well documented in both copepods and jellyfish. In copepods, if you test their feces after they've been exposed to oil, you can actually see that they've accumulated PAHs there as well, and that can be another potential mode of transport of those chemicals in the environment. With oysters, oysters are an interesting case. You would expect that they would bioaccumulate these compounds, but actually researchers found that they had a lack of incorporation of these oil-based compounds in their tissues. And there's a few different theories. Maybe they're physically shutting down during periods of high oil exposure, or perhaps that because the spill was during a time when they would have been spawning, when they released their eggs and sperm into the water, they were also purging their bodies of contaminants. There was a research paper that was recently published that indicates that oysters, the microbes that are in oysters are capable of breaking down as much as 42% of the oil that the oysters are encountering. So that's another possibility. In terms of the gametes, the eggs and sperm, and the larvae, impacts do happen due to PAH exposure, growth, development, settlement, but this occurs at extremely high levels that would not be likely in the nearshore environment. So if we turn our attention to higher order animals like, say, fish, similar to people, they have this really well-developed detoxification mechanism in their body. When they're exposed to oil, they're able to produce these proteins that break down these PAHs and help eliminate them from the body before they ever get accumulated in the tissues. This can be used to a natural resource manager's advantage because you can actually, say, sample killifish, which are notoriously homebodies, right? They like to hang out in their one location. You could sample killifish from location A, killifish from location B, and then be able to look at levels of this detoxifying protein and see which area is relatively more contaminated with oil. So, for example, here, this panel, these are both gill filaments from two different sites, the top being unoiled, the bottom being heavily oiled, and red is indicating that detoxifying protein. So, other impacts to individuals. Out in the field, something that fishermen were seeing a lot of were an increased number of fish with lesions on offshore areas, and this is an example of one of those losses of integrity. There's a number of factors that come into play with the formation of lesions in fish, but researchers were curious about if that lines up with the oil spill or not. And so there's still a lot more research that needs to be done, but so far they have seen that there is a positive correlation between pH levels in the water and the incidence of lesions. And finally, so there's been a lot of studies, as I mentioned, with killifish, and these are just a few of the studies. Some of these are also other species as well, but there's a wide variety of things that can happen under oil exposure, under PAH exposure. Something that researchers have found is that the age at exposure matters, level of exposure also matters, obviously. And while we see these impacts in the laboratory, it's not necessarily what we see in the field. And when Chris comes up here, she's going to be touching on that a little bit about why there's sometimes perhaps a disconnect between those two things. All right, so I'm going to ask Chris to come up.
So, Emily left on a note explaining the sort of individual level types of impacts that we've been seeing to some of our species, and she left you with thoughts about killifish. So along that same thread, how are species impacted by the spill, and how does this link to contaminated habitats? And this question relates to some of our GOMA actions in the Action Plan 3, such as identifying linkages among focal species of their habitats, and of course, it allows us to identify some data gaps. So let's start with sea turtles. Sea turtles are species that rely on a variety of habitats across a broad spatial scale, depending on their breeding phase and life stage. They begin life as hatchlings, of course, on beaches. They emerge from nests on beaches, and then they have to quickly scuttle up into the open ocean. They swim out there to grow and to feed and avoid predation. And one particular habitat of importance to young or juvenile sea turtles is sargassum. Sea turtles like to relate to floating habitats. Sargassum is one of those floating habitats. It provides them protection, and it's also a food source. But interestingly, sea turtles hang out around convergence zones, as do sargassum, as does oil. So when all those things come together, there's a potential risk. So when the juvenile turtles have reached breeding age, they start turning around and heading back towards shore. Of course, the females go to their natal beach, so the same beach from which they emerged as hatchlings, while the male turtles spend most of the time and the rest of their lives actually around the continental slope area. So there's a quick overview of the lifestyle, and of course, we know that Deepwater Horizon oiled many of those habitats. So the natural resource damage assessment done by NERDA quantified some of the injury to, or most of the injury to the turtles, and they found quite a range of loss to turtles. 94,900 to 202,600 turtles were lost to this spill. Of course, you can see the categories there, the hatchlings, the small juveniles, and the large juveniles and adults, and you can find all that in the PDARP. And they explain that by highlighting the surface, the oil surface habitat, as being a big part of that injury. So with that surface oil slick, that became problematic for turtles. It caused miring. So you can think of miring like a pig mires or wallows in the mud. Sea turtles were mired by the oil, but of course that's not by choice. A pig likes to mire in the mud. Sea turtles don't want to be mired in oil. And that caused problems of inhalation and ingestion. Of course, turtles need to breathe air, so they come up to the surface to breathe. And the miring potentially caused immediate death, and it also caused problems with mobility. So they weren't able to evade predators. They also weren't able to seek food. They need to swim in order to find food. Also, it's important to note that part of this injury quantification includes some response approaches, some emergency response approaches. So when a spill happens, emergency response personnel, volunteers, they all acted very quickly to try to remove and relocate many of the turtles at various life stages. One attempt was to move or translocate eggs to the Atlantic coast of Florida. So there was no oiling over there, so they moved a lot of eggs over there, and a lot of those turtles didn't make it. Other response activities included vessel strikes and dredging. So that's something to think about when going forward with management and response plans. Another species that relies on a variety of habitats are birds. They need pelagic offshore habitats, they need nearshore habitats like wetlands to survive and throughout their life cycle. And again, NERDA quantified their injury, and they did it by looking at the direct result of the spill versus potential lost reproduction. And you can see quite a range there. They looked at 93 different bird species that were lost to Deepwater Horizon, 56,100 to 102,400 lost birds. And if you look specifically at that lost reproduction line there, the trustees determined that's probably more towards the upper range. They probably underestimated some of the impact to our birds, and time will tell as we watch the populations through the generations. So moving away from those charismatic and highly migratory species for a moment and turning towards questions about fish populations. We have a lot of questions coming to us about the organism, or the things that Emily was talking about, the physiological growth and development impacts to fish. But how does that relate to the population and community and ecosystem levels? How do oil spills impact many organisms of the same species, and how does oil spill impact many different kinds of things living in an area or habitat? Well, there's a variety of studies that looked at this question. Specifically, there was one group of scientists that sampled seagrass meadows from Louisiana over to Florida, and they wanted to look at early-stage survival of these fish during the oil spill. Luckily, they had pre-existing catch data for these species. So they looked at their data from 2006 through 2010, And the results actually showed no impact to populations of these species in the seagrass meadow. So no impact. And in some cases, for some of these fish species, they actually found an increase in abundance of these species. Similarly, there was another study conducted that looked at brown and white shrimp in the bays of Louisiana, and they also found that those abundances increased after the spill. So what's going on here? How do we explain that? We know that oil is impacting our fish and shrimp at an organismal level, but it seems like populations are doing okay. Well, the scientists pose a lot of different ecological and animal behavioral types of reasons for this, but one that they all seem to agree on is that the actual management decision of closing fisheries may have obscured the population results of oil spill impacts. So because we went out and closed the fisheries to protect us from, potential harm from seafood, the populations of fish were actually able to reproduce and proliferate. And remember, they were looking at data from before the spill where fishing was occurring. So there was regular removal of fish from the populations, but during the spill there was not. So perhaps that catch data is not really truly representative. Moving to blue crabs. I like this study because it has very specific results pertaining to location. And so this group of scientists, Jones et al., they had questions about population connectivity, specifically for blue crabs in the northern Gulf of Mexico. They wanted to know how resilient these crabs were in the face of deepwater horizon. And so conducting these sort of population connectivity experiments requires looking at larval dispersal and larval settlement. And it's really hard to get out and collect large volumes of very tiny aquatic creatures such as blue crab. And it's very expensive, too. So these scientists turn to their computer models, and they use existing oceanographic, biological, and ecological data sets to make predictions. And the results show that virtually exposing blue crab to oil, they were exposed, and a certain portion survived oil spill exposure. And those survivors settled in a very specific habitat. They settled east of the Mississippi River Delta. And so that type of species-specific and location-specific information could be useful for emergency responders and natural resource managers when trying to prioritize response actions during or after an oil spill. Another example of looking at community impact. So this is Dr. Susan Snyder. She did this study as part of her PhD dissertation. That's her spread out next to her king snake eel on deck of their cruise ship, and research cruise ship, of course. And so she was looking at, she was part of a bigger team looking at fish health questions. That fish lesion slide that Emily showed earlier is from the same sort of research group. But she wanted to know about deep sea impacts and how oiled sediment potentially impacted some species living there. And so these three species all occupy sort of special little niches within the deep sea community. So she went with golden tilefish up there in the left-hand upper right corner. Golden tilefish, they burrow, so they bioturbate, which means they dig holes in the sediment using their mouth parts, and they also use their fins a little, so they dig down deep into the sediment. Then you've got the king snake eel. King snake eel, there actually isn't a lot of life history information available about these guys, but we do know that they hover at the surface of the sediment, grazing for food. They don't burrow quite as much as the golden tilefish. And then you've got your third suspect. You've got red snapper, who, as we know, if you're a fisher, they like to hang up out in the water column and relate to structures in the water, natural reefs, artificial reefs, oil rigs. So these three fish species represent a gradient of potential risk or a gradient of exposure from oiled sediment. So she went out and she caught these guys, and she sampled their liver bile looking for those PAHs we heard about from Emily earlier. And she found that actually their PAH concentrations increased over time. But for golden tilefish, that persisted for the 3-year study. Red snapper and king snake eel, they dropped back to normal levels about a year later into the study. So why did it persist for golden tilefish but not the other two guys? Well, she poses that it's the actual golden titlefish's lifestyle that caused this sort of result, that because it's burrowing down deep into the sediment constantly, there's potential there for re-exposure to buried oil. So it's constantly re-exposing, possibly re-injecting buried oil while the others had time to remove it from their systems. And it's important to note here, too, that those pH levels were below, much below, the levels of concern for seafood consumption. So back to this idea about lab results versus what we're seeing in the field. We get this question a lot. One really great review on this is by Dr. Joel Foldry. And if you want, we have on our website a recording of him giving a talk. This slide comes straight from his talk. He and his co-authors looked at many, many different papers, and albeit mostly fisheries, they were very focused on fisheries impacts for this example. And they found, of course, a lot of published studies showing that organismal level or individual level impact in the growth and development of fish. But again, only one study showing a population no impact, and in some cases very stable and an increase in abundance of population. So what's going on here? Why the disconnect? Well, I don't have time today to go through all of these factors, but on the left-hand side, you'll see why oil pollution may not have affected estuarine fishes at the population or community level despite the known responses at the organism level. And on the right, it highlights the logistical and structural challenges in detecting population level impacts following large-scale disturbances. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge of the management action of the fishery closure itself could have been obscuring some of those population level results. We've got lagged results that we have yet to see. There's other confounding environmental factors. There's behavioral things to consider when looking at this. But one note of importance is that perhaps what we're testing in the lab does not necessarily translate to what we see in the field. So different concentrations of dispersant and oil that we use in the laboratory setting may not be the reality when we go out into the field. Things might not change. It's really hard to replicate the natural setting in a lab setting. Also, some of the species that we tend to use, such as the killifish, might not be as representative as we hope them to be in the lab. Perhaps we need to look at other indicator species and consider other animals and creatures to help us figure out some of these population level and community level impacts. One more note. Our team has a lot of information on a variety of species. I don't have time to go through all of them today. Actually, my original set of slides had this in it, but just to condense it, we have information about red snappers, diet shift that's been connected to the oil spill. We have information about the unusual mortality event. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with that, of the dolphins in this area and how it relates to the oil spill. There's research showing plankton being impacted by the oil spill. I also have some information about new and exciting methodologies. So please do come talk to us if you have more information needs as it relates to wildlife and fisheries. We're always happy to hear your questions, and if we can't answer them, we're going to link you to those who can. So one more note. While scientists do agree that there was a lack of consistent pre-spill data, I see now that there's an opportunity before all of you to create new and improved monitoring programs, new and improved resource management plans that incorporate this type of information and data. It's up to you. The world is your oyster. Next up is Larissa, and she's going to talk about human communities.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about my favorite topic, which is people. So the first question we're going to answer is, what communities were impacted by the oil spill and how? So I wanted to start off with this map that was generated from the Gulf Coast Population Impact Study. And this map was created using two data sets. The first one is that shoreline oiling map that you saw that Monica presented, so the one when she was talking about oiled beaches and wetlands. And the second was BP claim data. So this is important because we can start to figure out what communities were probably most impacted by the spill. So you can see southeastern part of Louisiana, over here on the coast of Alabama, and also the panhandle of Florida. So scientists have done a lot of work in these areas, specifically, again, so they've looked at southeastern part of Louisiana, they've looked at the 2 coastal counties in Mississippi, 2 coastal counties in Alabama, and then in Florida, they've mostly focused their studies in Franklin County. And they've seen some similarities that have come up over and over again when they've looked at these populations. They've seen that people whose work, leisure, or family life, if it was disrupted by the spill, they were more likely to have negative mental health impacts. So, for example, they had higher levels of anxiety or depression. They were more commonly diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And also, when compared to the rest of the state, the folks that were in these coastal areas had more mentally unhealthy days compared to the rest of the state. So we've also seen one trend, that is, when we talk about these disruptions in life, people who lost their job or had a reduction in their income, those people were impacted more than others. So this includes 3 main industries along the Gulf Coast. So that's the oil and gas industry. We know during the oil spill there was a moratorium on drilling. Also the tourism industry, we know that some of the beaches were oiled, and also folks that didn't live on the Gulf Coast are seeing all these images on TV of all these oiled coastlines. So some of them canceled their vacations. And then also the fishing industry, we know that was closed. So Chris mentioned it, at one point at the height of the spill, about 36% of U.S. waters were closed to fishing. And in one regional study that looked at that sampled residents along the Gulf Coast, they saw about 28% in these impacted communities were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And of that 28%, 3/4 also had a reduction in income. So you can make that direct link between the 2. So out of those industries, if we want to narrow down even more, the fishing industry was hardest hit. So we know that the fishing industry, again, there's closed waters. So for example, one area in Barataria Bay was closed to fishing 5 years after the spill. So there's also, so those waters were closed as state and federal agencies were testing seafood to make sure it was safe for consumption. But despite all that testing, there's still this public perception that fishermen were really worried about, where people were still concerned to eat Gulf seafood. And then there's also the long-term uncertainty. So Chris talked a little bit about how we haven't seen a lot of those population-level impacts, but the fishing industry was still very concerned. Like maybe 10 years down the line, there might be a crash in the fishery. So this is a quote from one study participant that I think captures those feelings that people had. It said, "I'm not sure what to do right now. In the past, things will always seem like they pop up, but this time I see it coming to an end really, really fast here, and I'm just really kind of scared. I mean, it costs a lot of money to live." So this shows that the fishing industry was really concerned about during the oil spill. So scientists looked a little bit closer into the coastal counties of Alabama to try to get a better idea of what was going on. So they looked at our two coastal counties in Alabama, Mobile County and Baldwin County. And if you're not familiar, Mobile County really focuses on fishing industry. A lot of their folks are involved in the fishing industry, whereas Baldwin County, a lot of folks are involved in the tourism industry. And so they saw that right after the oil spill, in Baldwin County, there was a higher level of exposure, so we actually had oiled beaches, and then we also had more reported losses, so more claims. But when they looked at these two counties, they actually saw that residents in Mobile County were twice as likely to have these feelings of high stress. And so they think that was due to a few different things. So folks in Mobile County, again, those were the fishing industry folks, and they had a higher concern for their economic future and, again, greater uncertainty. Also, about a year after the spill, when they did the study, the tourism industry in Baldwin County was starting to recover, whereas, again, there's still that uncertainty with the fishing industry. And then you can see some other factors were taken into account as well. Lower education level, lower income, and also folks in Mobile County have lived there longer. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. So scientists have also shown that children were impacted by the spill. So more than half, this is from a study, if you remember that first slide that showed those impacted areas, these scientists went out and they talked to about 1,400 parents in those impacted communities, and more than half of those parents reported that their children were impacted by the spill. 41% said that their households had lost income during the spill, and 22% said that they noticed mental health changes or problems in their students or in their children. And you can actually make a direct tie between the two of these, because out of the parents who had lost income, they were 1.5 more times more likely to report a mental health impact in their children. So now to switch a little the gears and talk about what traits make communities more resilient. So scientists have done a lot of studies on this. The first thing I want to talk about is community attachment. So if you're not familiar with community attachment, it's how close you feel to people in your community and where you live. So how close you feel to one another and the place that you live in. So this can have pros and cons. A positive thing about that is that you have this strong network. So when you have a disaster, you have all these friends around you that can really help you overcome those feelings and cope with that disaster. On the other hand, if you're really attached to your community, you might not be willing to leave it, or you might be really scared if there is a disaster that you're going to just lose that sense of community. So scientists went into a community that had a really high level of attachment, and they saw that right after the spill, these people were feeling a lot of these negative feelings, so very worried, stressed, anxious, feeling bad. And they went back a year after, and they saw that these people were actually recovering better than folks that didn't have that high level of community attachment. So again, what we said, that was the pro to community attachment, is that these strong community networks and close personal relationships really were helping them overcome the impacts of the oil spill. This wasn't true for all communities, though. They went and these scientists looked at residents that had a high level of attachment but were in the fishing industry, and right after the spill, same things. They had a lot of these bad feelings. But when they went back a year after, they saw that these folks in the fishing industry were still suffering, and in some cases their conditions were worsening. And they think this is because, well, we talked about how the fishing industry was closed for a while, so they're still facing these hardships. And we also talked about that negative thing about community attachment, that it makes you not want to leave the place you live. So, you know, if the fisheries closed, they didn't want to get up and find another job. They didn't want to leave their home. The other thing scientists pointed out was this social network as well. So if you're around people, they think that folks might have been feeding off of one another. So if you're around people who are feeling a lot of bad feelings, so they're very negative and hopeless, and you're hanging around those people all the time, you might start feeling that same way. So scientists also looked at how surviving past disasters came into play during the oil spill. So we know that the Gulf Coast is no stranger to natural disasters such as hurricanes, but this disaster was a little bit different. So this was a man-made disaster. And folks were really concerned. They felt a lot of uncertainty about what that meant. So this is another quote from a study participant. With Katrina, we knew what to do. We needed to rebuild. With the oil spill, we don't know how long the recovery will take or if we'll even be able to recover. So they had a lot of these feelings of fear. But scientists went into these communities. This work was mostly done in southeastern Louisiana, and they saw that residents who lived through Katrina, they were more vulnerable to the effects of the oil spill right after it occurred, but they actually rebounded faster than other communities. So living through those past disasters helped them to be more resilient. Also, they found that residents that viewed themselves as more resilient actually were more resilient. So if you have a positive attitude and you're like, I can get through this, those people were more likely to do better years after the spill. Okay, so just a couple of other traits that I wanted to highlight. So meaning of life had a positive impact when it came to recovering after the oil spill. So that's the belief that you really are living your life in a way that stays true to what you believe in. So that if people felt like they had a meaning of life, then they were more likely to recover. On the other side, we saw that low income, especially folks below the poverty line, they did a study in Mississippi that showed that people that were below the poverty line, that was $20,000 a year they were making, they were heavily impacted by the spill. And again, less social support, which kind of ties into that community attachment. So if we throw out the other things that we talked about, we can see that we can start identifying traits that we might want to help communities build if we want them to be more resilient to not only oil spills, but also natural disasters as well, like hurricanes. So just to wrap things up, I wanted to highlight a few of the resources that are in place. So after the oil spill, there's been a lot of work that's been done to create these resources to help people during the next disaster. So the Gulf Region Health Outreach Program was started. This was funding from BP, and these are just 2 projects out of 4 that I want to talk about. And these 2 projects are working really hard to build up infrastructure, so to actually build healthcare centers, also promote partnerships, and then try to get people in so they have access to the healthcare that they need. So those are 2 things that are now, these are along all of the Gulf Coast states, and these centers now are in place for the next disaster. There's also been a lot of training that's been done. So there's Tulane University and the University of South Alabama have these community health worker training programs in place. So they've actually been training community members. And this is a great program because these folks are actually in their community. So they're trusted. People are probably more likely to come to them, and they will go to the doctor with them, take them if they have a vehicle. This is especially down in Bayou La Batterie. I've seen the success of this program where there's a big Vietnamese community that doesn't speak English, and so they have folks that are these community health workers who can go with them to the doctor's appointments, ask the questions, interpret the data. So that's a great program that's in place. We also, some of you might be familiar with this peer listener training manual. I don't know if anybody was a peer listener trainer. But yes, so we have that manual, and in case there is another disaster, we can pull that out again. And again, so if you're not familiar with this program, folks were trained to be peer listeners in their community. So again, it's these trusted people that they can come to. And then there's also these training programs for health professionals, and you can see these are some of the focus areas. So seafood consumption, airborne exposures and health impacts, studies on dispersants. So there's a lot of work that's been done on that too. There's also studies in place that have been monitoring health impacts. So the Deepwater Horizon Research Consortia has 4 projects that have been funded. These are in their 4th out of 5th year. They focus a lot on women and children, and then also they have done some work related to seafood consumption. There's the Gulf Study, which it's been going on since 2010. They started off, they had about 33,000 workers and volunteers that responded to the oil spill. They did about 11,000 home visits, so they're trying to get some long-term monitoring data of these workers that did respond to the oil spill. And then also the Association of Occupational and Environmental Clinics, they have a good program set up where if someone comes to a doctor and they're saying that they're feeling like they were exposed to dispersants or oil and they're having health impacts from that, they can actually refer them to a specialist who can the specialist can ask the correct questions to really get in on what's going on there. Okay, so I know we've covered a lot of ground. I'm just going to quickly cover a few resources, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So just a few things that the team wanted to share as some resources you all might be interested in. So the first one is our website. So if you guys have noticed, right, I got to put a plug in for it. So you notice on every single slide there's our web address, but there's 2 important things here. The first one is our publications. They're also, as Steve mentioned, outside on the racks, but you can get the PDFs here. You can see what topics they focus on. We have a wide array. And then Chris also mentioned that we have our presentations online. So this one is being recorded. We have all of the presentations. So we've had experts come in, and we've recorded those presentations so you can listen to those as well. And those range from, so they focus on dispersants, fisheries, impacts to habitats. Where the oil went was our most recent one. So check that out. The Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative also has an electronic newsletter that they send out. I think it's every other week it comes out. And that, you can sign up if you're interested here. And that highlights different projects, new publications, different things like that. Related to publications, they also have a publication database. So this is on the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative's website. You can actually go and search by any keyword, by author, by theme area, lots of different ways to find information. And you can not only get the newest publications, but you can also, it's kind of hard to see, but you can also figure out what projects are underway right now. So when Steve, in the beginning, he had that slide up where it showed all the different priority issue teams, their topics. This is where we got those numbers of how many projects are related to things that, if you're working with some of the GOMA pits, you might be working on. Okay, this is one of the best ones here. This is the GridC database. So all of the projects that have been funded by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. All that information is publicly available. All that data is publicly available. So if you go to, so GRISC stands for the Gulf Research Initiative Info and Data Cooperative. If you go there, you can search the data. We did a quick search here just to show you kind of what it looks like. So we searched for water quality. This is a project that's collecting a whole bunch of information, as you can see here, off the Texas-Louisiana continental shelf. So we have all of the sample sites here. If you look, it's a little hard to see down here, but there's the metadata. Actually see what you're looking at. There's also publications, so there's a little tab where if there's a publication related to this data set, that will be listed there with a link so you can access it. And then the most important button, which is right here, where you can actually download the data. So, GRISC, remember that, in case you want to incorporate that into any of those action plans. So there's lots of other tools. I know there's a tools cafe coming up. We just wanted to highlight 3 of them here, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with the NOAA diver site. That's all the natural resource damage assessment data is up there. Also IRMA, so that map that Monica showed with, again, the shoreline oiling, we actually made that map in IRMA. Paige can tell you all about that tool because she works for NOAA. But that is a great way to look at the data that was collected during the oil spill. You can actually click on different layers, they'll pop up, you can make different maps. Also GCOOS. So lots of other data sets in the Gulf of Mexico, so, and many more. There's also a lot of educational resources. If you're not familiar, the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative has a documentary, which is narrated by Matt Damon. Try to get him to come to that. No, I'm just kidding. Then we would have had this room would have been packed. Anyway, so they have the documentary up there, but they also have these short little, like, 2 to 4 minute clips, which are really great about different research projects. The Smithsonian has this ocean portal, which if you haven't checked it out, they have all these different topics that relate to the oil spill. It comes up with this image, and then you can click on these little X's, and it brings up another image, which kind of gives you more information about that topic. And then GoMRI also has a page right here, education, the education page, and that has different things. It has different projects, lesson plans, all different educational resources. And again, many more. So just the last slide we have here is a plug for the Gulf of Mexico Oil Spill and Ecosystem Conference. It's going to be here in Louisiana, but over in New Orleans, and that's in February. And again, I know we covered a lot of information, but we appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to us. And I guess at this point, we'll take any questions that you guys might have for the team.
So Larissa, can you announce people can chat?
Oh, sure.
40 people online.
So for folks that are online, if you want to chat any questions in, we will answer them as well. Any questions? I know someone back there had a question for Monica, I think, when you first started. Go ahead.
Because it's being recorded, do you want us to introduce ourselves?
Oh, that would be good, if you'd like.
Okay, Jamie Littender with Florida Department of Environmental Protection. My question was about the epibiota that are associated with the mangrove and the oil spill. Was that directed, or was that research directed on the perimeter of these islands, or was it throughout? Do you know, or do you have access to the research? I do have access to the research. Okay. I don't know. From what I recall, it was to the perimeter. Perimeter. Yes. Okay. But I can double check that, or I mean, I can send you the paper and yeah. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions?
There's one question online. It says, has any of this information been used locally, regionally, or nationally to encourage alternative energy sources? Or was any of this information used for the compilation of BOEM's EIS to open new lease areas in the Gulf of Mexico? Specifically, it seems that this information would not support opening the Gulf of Mexico to new additional leases.
That's a loaded question. They do their name and where they're from.
Yeah, we do have their information. We can follow up.
Okay. Yeah, we'll wonder.
You want to say another question? We'll follow up.
Oh, yes. We'll follow. Well, and we can say one thing. I don't know if it's been incorporated into those plans, but emergency responders are one of our key audience types that we do a lot of work with. So we've given presentations at different area committee meetings, regional response. Yeah, they've come to a lot of our seminars. So some of the folks in the emergency responder audience, are plugged into this research. I don't know if it's been used in those plans or not. But it's something we can definitely work on in our next phase.
Yeah, and I just point out that in terms of the lease plan and stuff, that would be on the planning side, not on the response side.
Okay.
That's sort of a difference.
So maybe another.
I know that some of them certainly pay attention to research that's going on and whether or not they're interacting with you all may or see in some of the research out there. So I would assume that it has been taken into consideration when you do an EIS. You have to look at, no alternative, whether or not alternative fuel sources are a consideration in that. I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, I'm here with Trey from Bessie, which is actually Bones' sister agency. What information was available when they were developing the IES at the time was certainly used for that purpose. What information has now become available since February, the settlement of the NERDA activities, is still informing the process. It's important to remember that what's out for public comment right now is the next 5-year lease plan. That doesn't start until 2017. So it's out for public comment, which means it's still open. So any additional information that Bones has access to, such as the stuff that's available now since February, it will still inform the process of developing that lease plan.
Thanks, Gary.
We're getting a lot of questions coming in online, but we also want to answer some questions in the room. If a question is posed, do you mind restating it?
Sure.
Does anybody else have a question in the room before we? Okay. What spill-associated health impacts have been observed in responders?
Okay, so, the question was what health-related impacts have been observed in responders, and so to date, the papers have not come out related to that yet, so there's no published information yet. I do know that they're focused on eye and lung irritation. This is through the Gulf study. Also, high blood pressure was another one they're looking at, and I think that's going to be out probably within the next 6 months. So stay tuned on that. We'll have a publication eventually, I'm sure, on that topic. Steve, you should just come over here.
Here's another question pertaining specifically to community resilience studies. Did the authors account for the influence of misinformation in coastal communities impacted by this bill?
Okay, so it relates to misinformation. So is that, do you think they're talking about seafood safety there?
It just said misinformation.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a lot of information that was shared that might not be accurate.
There was. Well, and I don't know the answer to that, but I can say that we talk a lot about risk communication and trying, I think, actually LaDon and I were just at a meeting the other day where we talked a lot about, after the oil spill, how hard it was to get information in a timely manner. So that is something that I think was viewed as a problem, and folks are trying to overcome and try to find better ways. So if there is another oil spill, we can get that information out sooner so we can answer people's questions. I was not answering it at all, but.
Any more questions?
Tracy?
That's a question. So this is a question that I received, and I want to know if I pointed them in the best direction or if you have suggestions. So I work with local floodplain managers, and so the floodplain manager from the city of Biloxi, when we're talking about other flood-related issues, and he just said, and how about all the stuff on the oil spill? Like, what can you tell me about the impacts of the oil? Because, sometimes I get questions, and I don't really know where to send people. And so then I immediately responded with a lot of the publications that you all have put together, but it occurred to me after sitting in a city council meeting not long after that that even that was probably not going to be
useful if he was communicating with his city council member. And so I guess the question is, I think that's great for that audience. Is there like a, top few things, statements that we could say that then kind of like an elevator speech that if he was trying to communicate this message, what are those most important messages that you found? That are the same questions that come up over and over and over again, and we want to be sure that those things get communicated, or are there any at this point?
So what one of you is your FAQ. Go grab it from all the
So we actually decided one of our publications is the top 5 frequently asked questions from an oil spill.
Thank you.
So there's a publication out there that after meeting with over 500 folks from all over the Gulf of Mexico, we decided, hey, these are the questions that keep coming up. Why don't we just do a quick synopsis? And it's not like one question is the seafood safe to eat? And Larissa has a whole publication on that, but we completely just crunched it up and put it in like a 2 to 3 paragraph form, which is one of the, I think, the number 1 question. And then the other ones were, did the oil go? What response techniques were used during the oil spill? There was one on aquatic impact, and what's the 5th one?
So the safe to swim in the water.
Safe to swim in the water. Those were the top 5 questions we were asked when we were conducting these interviews. So the publication's right outside, or available on this website as well. I think we found that one's been the most popular one so far, or at least for people to communicate about the local science.
And that question pertains to the struggle that we've had as a team is trying to frame our science appropriately for each of the different audiences and trying to find the best way. So the remainder of our workshop today, if you guys have ideas or suggestions and, best practices on the different audiences and how to approach them, please share.
Very helpful.
And actually that leads into another question online here. Has any of this information been used by or has it been asked for by the tourism community, and if so, in what way?
I'm going to take that one.
So we have that
Maybe on the spot.
So the question was, has this oil spill information been asked for by the tourism audience, and in what way was it used? Is that correct? So I think most recently we had a request from someone in Alabama. There was an article in the popular press in a local newspaper, I think, and they, I don't want to say that they misstated, but maybe they editorialized a little bit one of the recent studies by a researcher about levels of, was it dispersants or PAHs? Of PAHs in on beaches, and he was concerned that this was going to cause a lot of problems in the community with people not feeling safe to go to the beach this summer, and is there actually cause for concern, and what's the best course of action? So some of that information we provided to him about PAH levels and how those might line up with some of those benchmarks, those thresholds from the EPA that I mentioned during this talk today. He was able to use that to be able to have hopefully better conversations with people in the future.
Any more questions in the room? All right, I'll do one more question here. Does population data for crabs and shrimp extend to very recent harvests like this year? I know not, but is anyone seeing data on reduced catches as being reported in the fishing community?
Let's repeat that question.
So I'll does population data for crabs and shrimp extend to the very recent harvest like this year?
No, and does population data relating to shrimp and crab extend into this year?
So has the population decreased? Do we know that?
We don't know that yet. That's not being revealed in the oil spill science data. If they're talking about land use data, that's a completely different approach to understanding that question. And there's actually a publication available talking about the challenges in using harvest or land use data to ask those population kinds of questions. So I encourage the person online who asked that question to go online to our website and download that publication. But yeah, the oil spill scientists themselves, they have a need for the pre-spill data looking at population numbers and community assemblage numbers before the spill in order to compare it to now. And I mentioned briefly in my portion of the presentation earlier that there was a lack of that consistent data. So a lot of our state agencies and other organizations that have access to those types of population numbers before the spill, that would be, very useful information. I know Texas Parks and Wildlife, of course, on the Texas Sea Grant rep, so I'll give a shout out to them. They have an extensive data set, not always consistent, but about 4 years worth of data, and BOEM has their own set of data as well. So if there's ways to think about incorporating existing data, but also looking at, for natural resource managers, looking at their own existing management plans and how to incorporate catch data monitoring programs into what you're already doing, that would be a way to sort of look into the future and preparing ourselves to understanding these population questions. We know we need consistent data collection for species and populations and communities, so how are we going to do that?
Thank you. And one last question came in, and then we'll transition to the final activity. The question was Corexit referred to, was it Corexit 9500, 9527, or some other Corexit?
So the question was, in the studies that I referred to with the Corexit testing, which variety of Corexit was it, or was it Corexit at all? So it was actually Corexit 9500A. Nice meeting you.
Quick question. Yes, that's kind of what they're looking for. Do you remember quantities of each of those? Was it like 90+% of it, 9,500, because they exhausted the reserves in about 4?
I believe that they used mainly 9500A, but I couldn't tell you what proportion was used.
We can look that up.
Yeah, we can definitely look that up.
In one of our publications. We're in there. Go back and look.
Oh, great. Well, thank you all. This is kind of a bonus for us. We got a presentation and a little bit of a sauna, at least for those of you in the room. Thank you all for lasting in here. It's finally a little bit cooler in here. And thank you for everybody who's on the phone. We do have one last thing that we'd like to ask from you, and as we promised, we were going to ask you some questions at the end as well. And these are the 3 questions, and you'll each get an evaluation. I guess we could hand those out now. And the evaluation has question number 3 on there. So as you fill out the evaluation, hopefully you can answer number 3. And the first 2 questions, you're getting some sticky notes. You might get 3 or 4. If you need more, that's fine too. We have out on the whiteboard out here on the flip chart paper, because there's not really enough room in here for all of us. If you can answer those 2 questions on looking at it from the GOMA perspective, and then looking at a broader perspective, and answer those and put those on the flip chart, again, that will help inform us as we continue to move forward. Those of you on the phone, we ask that you submit that through the chat box. We will be recording anything that gets submitted in the chat box, or you're also welcome to always email us at any time any of this feedback. We'll also follow up and electronically send you the evaluation probably later today or tomorrow. Does anybody have any final questions before we conclude the input session? One last thing for those of you, if everybody on the phone is done, we'll talk with you all later. Please email me if you have any other questions or want to provide input. So this is the conclusion of the session. We'll hang up now, and thank you again. This recording will be posted online within the next 2 weeks as well. Thank you for joining this session.